Okay, welcome everyone. I'm very excited for today's panel. My name is Anna Mills. I'm a writing instructor at Kenyatta College and author of an open educational resources textbook, and I curate a resource list on writing and AI for the Writing Across the Curriculum Clearinghouse. Today, I wanted to introduce our panelists who are here to give advice and perspectives on teaching critical AI literacy. First, we'll hear from Nicholas Provenzano. Nicholas is the Makerspace Director at University Liggett School in Michigan. He is also an author, international speaker, and consultant. His musings can be found on thenerdyteacher.com, and his best-selling books include Your Starter Guide to Makerspaces, The Maker Mentality, and Beyond the Poster Board. You can find him on X, Threads, and Instagram at @thenerdyteacher. Our next panelist, Latrice P. Johnson, is writer, scholar, mother, teacher, and intellectual. She works as an associate professor of secondary English language arts and literacy at the University of Alabama. She is an equity-oriented scholar whose research examines the literacy practices of historically marginalized youth in and outside of school. Before joining the faculty at UA, Dr. Johnson taught middle and high school language and literature in Atlanta public schools. She enjoys yoga, writing, and helping others to find their writer within. Dr. Leslie Allison and Dr. Tiffany DeRule are faculty members in the Department of Writing Arts at Rowan University, where they teach writing courses focused on news and information literacy, technology criticism, and research-based writing in various genres. And our final panelist, Daniel Estrada, is a university lecturer in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the New Jersey Institute of Technology in Newark, New Jersey. Daniel has a background in philosophy and computer science and teaches courses in engineering ethics, AI ethics, and philosophy of mind. And with that, I will turn it over to Nicholas for our first presentation. Thank you so much. And a note to everyone to feel free to put your questions in the Q&A at any point. We have a good chunk of time at the end for Q&A. So after we hear from all the panelists, then we'll go into the questions. So thank you for that participation.
Well, perfect. Hi, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about really empowering educators while addressing the ethical and practical concerns. I've already spent lots of time working with teachers all across the country because AI is the thing. If you've even looked at any tech conferences, you will see all of the AI sessions because everyone has all the answers already. It's amazing how quickly all of that is unfolded. But I think we really need to focus on answering some of those simple questions. Like, first off, all students are going to cheat. Oh my goodness, this is the end of the world. As a teacher, we will never be able to have any type of original content ever again. And there's this fear that is pervasive with any new technology. And that's one of the things I want to point out is that there's a difference between fear and healthy skepticism. And healthy skepticism is awesome. For anything that a teacher should ever want to use in the classroom, there should be a healthy amount of, well, what's really going on here? What type of impact does this have? But again, the newest technology, 1768, the Encyclopedia Britannica, all of a sudden, this information was available to students. And then, of course, Wikipedia. I was teaching high school ELA and Wikipedia came out, and all of a sudden, teachers were like, all of that information, it's plagiarism, it's copying, how do you cite this? And, there wasn't an MLA citation for internet resources available. And so people were worried. And it was a scary time for educators because every new technology poses questions. One I just gave an example in a PD meeting the other day was when TVs and VCRs were rolling out, there was this fear teachers were going to be replaced by videoed lessons and that you didn't need a teacher anymore because you could just record a single lesson and play it in every single class. There's this fear that AI is now going to replace teachers in instruction. And I think it's normal knee-jerk reaction that I understand, but really we've seen this cycle of new technology and reaction over and over and over again, and it's important to just keep things sort of in mind. Uh, what are more pressing concerns than the plagiarism idea that is going to pervade education is flat out accuracy. So right off the bat, it's important to understand how accurate or inaccurate a lot of these large language models can be. So for one example, the ChatGPT prime number accuracy in March was 98%, and it dropped to less than 3% by June. Code creation accuracy fell during the same period. So all of a sudden, basic math accuracy was out the window. So this fear that students are going to use this to cheat, I would be more worried about the fact that students are just going to have bad misinformation. I mean, back in the day, a student using Cliff Notes at least was getting a fairly accurate review of a story. Now, it might not even be the story at all. The factual inaccuracies are there. And it's something I demonstrate in the classroom because it's important for teachers not to ignore this, but to have this conversation. I pulled it up, asked for a biography on a random president, and then we fact checked it. About 40% of it was wrong. And the students go, well, what's the point? I go, well, exactly. What could you do instead? Well, we could search these resources and find the information. Exactly. And that's one of the things I've reinforced with my students, that if you're going to use this and then you're spending the time checking the accuracy, how is this saving you time? We're not at a point where we can just wholeheartedly trust this information, which is another skill set that we're trying to impart to our students as young as middle school and really even younger, to have that conversation of, you need to verify information you find online. Here are some resources that are trustworthy. Here are some that you want to double check. And why make yourself have more work if you don't need to? And of course, the other part of it is the bias concern. Who is creating these models? Who's feeding this information? Where are they getting this information from? What type of accuracy or opinions are you getting? And so for students, and I love this example that I found. I'm trying to move my little stat here. It's got it in the way. In this example, here we go. The politics of AI, ChatGPT, and political bias. You plug in these questions and you have issues. I remember when Bard rolled out, and I was playing around with it as it was released, and I asked, hey, can you write an email to my boss because I'm out with COVID? So write that email for me. And it said, ooh, I can't do that just yet. But when I said, can you write an email saying I'm out sick? It had no problem. It spit out an email. So it was programmed to avoid that question for right now. So those biases or those hot button topics might not even be accessible. So when you're looking at this information, it's a problem because biases are everywhere. And that's important to understand, especially as a classroom teacher. And along with that is access. The digital divide is real. And so all of a sudden, if you're creating tools that only certain students have access to, you're creating a giant digital divide where now students feel they have, better support, better access to information. And again, where is that information coming from? Is it just a feedback loop of the same types of people accessing the information? Like, those are serious questions that every teacher, every administration of a school needs to ask. Because if you're not going to create an equitable atmosphere for these students to learn, that's a serious problem to consider. The other big one is the data mining. That's giant. What information are you giving to these companies? When you log in, when you sign in, student data, there are tons of federal and state regulations when it comes to student data. And too often teachers are just signing up willy-nilly for whatever they want. That's a problem. Those are the conversations that need to be had, whether it's the IT people, whether it's the administration, but just taking your teacher account and then facilitating that information into these elements. It's a huge problem. And it's a conversation as we try to focus on securing student data. We need to be ready to have those conversations. And a lot of them even say, you need to be 13, you need to be 16, you need to be... And we have teachers just freely having kids use it in class, and they're in middle school where they don't have permission to use it. So those are serious things that need to be addressed because we want to model data security for students. But if we are freely giving up their information because frankly, they're not young enough to really wrap their head around it, that's really problematic. For teachers that look at using it, I mean, there are ways to have these conversations and to explore this in terms of refining lessons, idea generation, differentiation, chunking. There are ways if you want to explore using this as a personal instructional tool to help generate ideas. There's a way to do that without giving up all of this data in terms of student information or that type of it. And for students, it's the same way. I really see this as an opportunity in the right circumstances to support neurodivergent students who need the extra support, whether it's adjusted reading levels, summaries, outlines, chunking of their reading. AI, hopefully in a real world, automates those tasks that take up time where we could be doing more human, creative, instructional, personal things. That's how I look at it. Like if I use something automated, the goal is to allow me to have more one-on-one time with a student, to make that personal connection, because that's something that cannot be replaced. It can't be removed from really what makes great learning and education. So for the teachers that are worried, I would say if you always focus on those human connections, you're going to be just fine. But if you can find ways to automate some of the things that you can do in an ethical way that preserves data, that allows you to focus on human interactions, that's a huge success for our students. And lastly, it's keeping a discerning eye. Like all things, whether it is a random lesson you found online, whether it is a web tool, someone suggested you look at it, take all of this with a discerning eye. Look at it, research it. Are you not sure? Talk to your IT admin. Say, hey, can you dig deeper into the terms of service for this? Because I'm interested in using it. Can I use my student account for this? Can I use my teacher account for this? We have to ask questions. We have to hold these companies accountable. I mean, how often are terms of services just things are buried in there, and it isn't until a reporter does the research and says, ooh, apparently they say they will now own everything you put in there. And people respond, I had no idea. It's there. And as teachers, if you want to use these tools, you have to also take that burden of accountability where you say, I am using something that I believe is good and safe for my students in my learning environment. So as we sort of look at what comes next, we're going to see these waves of education specifically focused, bots and AI and all the fancy labels they're going to give them. And as an educator, for me, it's going to be a lot of yields and pumping the brakes because every single thing will have to be vetted like every other tool that we use. So for all the educators out there, or for people that know educators, ask them the question of whether or not they've spent the time reviewing these terms of services, vetting these, and know what it actually means to give up that data, because those questions will hopefully force people to stop and think before just opening the floodgates to students and teachers. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Nicholas Provenzano. And now I'm glad to introduce Latrice Johnson, our next panelist.
Thank you very much. That's this chat. All right. So I came to define writing the South while working with a group of Black and Black queer youth during a high school writing club. We would get together once a week after school, share food and write. We kept journals, talked about our lives, read meaningful texts, and laughed. Sometimes we cried. I was also present for other aspects of their lives. I attended plays, games, and family dinners. I taught my university class at their school, and some of the students would stop by during the school day. Each week, I extended invitations in the form of writing prompts, ones that asked them to think about who they were now and were becoming. I used the invitation to think about my own being and becoming. I modeled the type of writing I wanted them to consider for themselves, writing that allowed them to claim a space in the world, writing that storied their lives and lived experiences. I wanted them to be able to see what writing had brought to my life and that it could mean more than what they or their teachers had imagined for them. They talked about how writing in school was much different than writing during writing club. Teachers make it a point to tell us about one day. They may say, you may not like poetry or writing about characterization, but one day you will need to apply for a job, write a college entrance essay, or send an email to your boss, which may motivate a handful of learners to engage with Shakespeare or the Great Gatsby. But the line of argument seems to fall short for any real reason to write. And why wouldn't we give students a reason to write today? A reason to write that illuminates their remarkable present, writing that reflects who they are and who they want to be beyond students. Now, I am a teacher who has been limited by my own views of writing. I learned and taught my students about Hyde that writing had three purposes: to persuade, inform, and entertain. However, as I developed my writing pedagogy and practice, and while writing with young people, I realized that writing allowed us to innovate, to deconstruct existing paradigms that will only have us produce writing for limited purposes and only for our teachers or our future bosses. I realized that all of these purposes were outward facing, all about the audience. But what of the writing? What kind of writing allows us to look inward? What about writing to think, imagine, claim, reclaim, and reflect? What about the type of writing that invites historically marginalized youth to use their own languages to write themselves into the world that would have them silenced and forever on the margins? What about writing that helps ourselves connect to the things that we learn, to make meaning of the many ways that we are and are becoming? What about writing to claim a place in different bodies of knowledge, like history, geometry, or botany? Writing the self involves a dialogic process of talking and writing about one's life trajectory, personal identity, and lived experience, as well as practices that support intellectual, academic, personal, and social engagement. For Black and Black queer youth in the writing club, writing the self revealed their truths about being, their families, and other aspects of their lives that interrupted heteronormative landscapes and claimed spaces of being and becoming that were joyful, transformative, and liberating. It allowed them to question the world around them and imagine more just futures. And so when I thought about what does writing the self have to do with AI, the first answer was nothing. But I know that nothing is the answer if this was the type of writing we invited young people to do in schools. Unfortunately, most school session writing is about being objective and distancing the self from what is learned. How many times have you told a student or have been told not to use I in academic writing? There are other ways we ask writers to separate themselves from what they're learning. We ask them to interpret literature the same ways it's been interpreted before. We ask them to write about people that they will never meet and ignore the ways that they might engage intelligently and intellectually within community with families or neighbors. According to Yagelski, mainstream views of writing instruction reinforce a sense of separation in the world. And this is how one may come to be concerned about AI's impact on the teaching of writing in schools. When we lead with notions that academic texts have specific and limited purposes, and that the result is worth more than the process, then getting an application like ChatGPT to do the work seems reasonable. Teachers may also encourage particular students to use AI in order to improve their writing. However, this notion could be problematic for Black students in particular, as cultural deficit perspectives and racist constructions of language, literacy, and literacy achievement are used to explain why they do not do as well as their white counterparts. Damaging perspectives influence how Black students are educated in schools, as well as how teachers perceive and instruct in writing. Traditionally, writing instruction for marginalized youth has been about data and grammar and technical skills and anti-Black, and has lacked the kind of engagement that leads to liberation. And so I tried ChatGPT. The first prompt simply required analysis and critique of Everyday Use, a short story by Alice Walker. For the teacher who may teach Black students and encourage them to only use standardized language in their writing, for the teacher who thinks that the product is more important than the process, or for the teacher who cares little about young people writing themselves into what they are learning, this essay will do the job. However, when I created an invitation to write the self and connect the lived experiences to what I've learned, relying on AI is a little bit trickier. My prompt this time included that I choose an artifact from my own life and connect a memory to it, and connect those memories to the things in Alice Walker's short story. AI generated a paragraph that connected a memory to an artifact to everyday use, but it was not my memory. And the first time it used the same exact example as a story. The response had very little to do with my lived experiences, and it also failed to make any authentic connection. One of the aspects writing the self allows for all students. Writing that connects the self and the world includes the use of our languages to question the social constructions of the self and challenge the status quo in an effort to discover alternative paths for self and social development. Writing the self is also about the act of writing, as being intellectual, being present. Writing classrooms specifically are obligated to create opportunities for students to interrogate perspectives, produce countertext, and imagine a more just world. Writing the world is a personal, human, and intellectual experience. It is not the texts themselves that make a difference. It is in the act of writing that we are transformed, that we are more knowledgeable, that we are made anew. AI does have a role in this. Just like tools that help us locate the right word to use, we can use AI in writing processes as we can teach young people to do the same. We can teach them to use AI ethically and responsibly. So I consider the question again, what does AI have to do with writing, specifically for historically marginalized youth? My short answer was nothing. But in reality, educators mustn't use these technologies as another excuse to ameliorate the writing of African-American language users or perpetuate standardization and normalization, but that we give all students access to technologies that make their lives easier and more efficient. More importantly, teachers of writing in particular must locate writing pedagogies and practices that support the development of critical consciousness and center the everyday lived experiences of historically marginalized youth. So much of what students read, do, and study in school are devoid of images, languages, and texts that remind them of their own intellectual lineages. For Black students in particular, humanizing views of writing instruction have the potential to transform their relationship with learning and writing as they come to understand that their experiences provide context and content for a critical examination of their worlds. With such an understanding, writing becomes a way for them to confront racism, injustice, and structural disadvantages in their lives within communities and around the world. And in doing so, writing becomes a way for students to reclaim and assert their own beautifully complex humanity with and without AI technologies. If teachers are concerned about how students will use AI to write papers for them, then they may include the type of writing that recognizes the transformative and restorative power in the act of writing, and invite all young people to write the self. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Latrice Johnson. And now I want to invite Dr. Leslie Allison and Dr. Tiffany DeRule to share with us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Tiffany DeRule, and today Dr. Leslie Allison and I will be discussing online search and student research practices in the era of LLMs. There is a QR code and a tiny URL, Research Meets LLMs here, if you'd like to follow along on the slides. So we are faculty in a writing arts department, and we've spent a lot of time thinking about pedagogies surrounding information literacy and students' research-based writing. And today we're thinking about our goals and learning outcomes in these areas and how they relate to generative AI chatbots and other tools. We did prep for a shorter presentation time, and so we cut some conversation on the structural differences between LLMs and search engines. So we're hoping that we can dig into some of those ideas with you in a bit more depth during the Q&A. And with that in mind, I want to begin by drawing attention to the works of scholars Chirag Shah and Emily Bender, who have really informed our thinking about LLMs and search. And we don't really have time to dig into these today, but they offer really important reflections and analyses on the stakes and implications of LLMs being positioned as tools for information retrieval and access. So we recommend these works for anyone who is interested in exploring deeper. So as a quick overview of the key questions we're going to consider today, we'll start by thinking about what we already know about student research practices and the kinds of research strategies that we want students to practice. And then Leslie will move into talking about LLMs and whether they complement or complicate these practices. And then finally, thinking about what does a good research pedagogy in the age of LLMs look like? So first is, what do we know about student research practices? I think the first point to emphasize is that many of our students really are novice researchers. So regardless of any assumptions about digital natives, and also recognizing that many students have real aptitude and skill for navigating online tools and platforms. When it comes to information literacy, and probably any educator here knows, the online landscape continues to present many real challenges and complexities, and it's constantly evolving. A lot of studies and anecdotes show that students, as well as most adults, don't inherently know how to locate credible and trustworthy information, how to evaluate sources, determine their angle of vision, how to recognize mis and disinformation, etc. So surveying the research on high school and college student information retrieval and evaluation practices, two themes emerged for me. And the first is that students' approach to research as a practice is informed by the tools that they are likely to use. So in other words, when Google became the dominant search engine, it began to shape how people think about information access and retrieval. So when we think about an entire generation becoming accustomed to querying Google for every kind of question, it's not surprising that someone who is approaching college-level research for the first time would default to this same trusted tool. And anecdotally, I find that many of my students are inclined to approach research through a kind of Google autopilot, where you start with a thesis statement, you decide what you want to say, you go to Google, you find someone else who said what you want to say, you pick 3 links that say what you want to say, you paste them in your paper, right? And so research shows that Google is the predominant information-seeking tool relied on by high school and college students, and this Google-centric strategy is likely to be employed regardless of goals and context. Studies show that students are likely to only use the first page of Google search results. So in one study, it was 92% of students didn't go past the first page of search results. Students are likely to prioritize accessibility to full text over other selection criteria. So if they can get it online quickly, they're going to pick it. And related to that, students are likely to make do with results that are less than ideal. And this is a process that's called satisficing. So does it basically meet the assignment expectations? We're going to go with that. So a second theme that emerges from recent studies on student research habits is that students' research practices are also informed by what they are taught. And many students are taught to evaluate information online using outdated methods that don't really reflect the evolving online information landscape. So for example, many students come to college with the idea that .gov and .org sites are better than .com sites, and that the best way to evaluate a website is to read the content carefully, examine the website carefully, pay attention to things like the design of the website. And these methods for evaluating sources come from earlier decades of the internet and even pre-internet practices. And we know now that these are not only ineffective, but also even dangerous ways of approaching information online. You're more likely to be misled if you trust a website just because, for example, it's a .org, or it looks professional, or it sounds credible. And so in response to these kinds of findings, scholars have developed new recommended practices for evaluating information online and selecting sources. For example, lateral reading, like a fact checker, Michael Caulfield's SIFT method. And these efforts are all in recognition that information seeking is a complex task, and students need explicit instruction and scaffolding to do it well. And so the takeaway here is that how students conduct research, how they access and evaluate information is important and has real stakes that go far beyond the classroom. We've had to recognize that Google is a predominant tool for search, and we've learned to respond to Google search and other technologies like micro-targeted algorithms, for example, that shape our information seeking. And so now we see this new dimension to conversations about search and information literacy. At least in some circles, we're seeing large language model tools and generative AI chatbots being positioned as the next phase of our online information retrieval and search. We're seeing journalism covering the potential threat that chatbots pose to search engines, as well as articles instructing teachers and students on how to use ChatGPT for search. And this April 2023 PC Mag survey that found that 42% of respondents said that they believed generative AI chatbots are going to replace search engines. So what does this mean? How should we as educators respond? What we're going to focus on for the rest of our time today is more reflection on what happens and what is potentially lost when LLMs are treated as search engines. So I will hand it over to Leslie.
Thank you, Tiffany. So before we have any conversation about how or whether to integrate large language models into student research, we should first ask ourselves, what research practices do we want students to develop? So librarians and other information science experts have thought about this question for decades, and there are lots of theories and models of the research process. But a popular one that K through 12 librarians often teach is Eisenberg and Berkowitz's model, which identifies 6 discrete tasks of research. So those tasks are task definition. What is my research topic, for example? Information seeking strategies. How am I going to find this information? Location and access of that information, use of that information, synthesis of that information, and then finally evaluation and output of that research. So in the past 20 years or so, where Google has really dominated, search engines have played an outsized role for our students when they're researching. And especially they're playing an outsized role in steps 2 and 3. So that has its advantages. It seems like a ubiquity of information, but we also note that it has a lot of problems that Tiffany just discussed. But by and large, the other 4 steps of the research process have not really been impacted by search engines like Google. But LLMs pose a new novel problem. They are powerfully capable of mimicking all stages of the research process. For example, they can rhetorically perform the move of narrowing down a research topic. They can offer students methods for finding evaluation. They can mimic the process of locating and accessing sources. They can produce text that looks like synthesis. And of course, as we all know, they can produce a final product that creates the illusion of creating the research process or completing the research process. So it's worth dwelling on why large language models like ChatGPT perform these research tasks all in the same query box and all on the same page. So if we think about it from a tech design perspective, technology companies privilege what they call a frictionless experience. So as you can see on this slide, tech companies try to reduce friction in 3 key domains. They try to reduce it in interaction. So how are the users actually using the product? They are also trying to reduce friction cognitively. How much mental effort is the user required to use our product? And then they're also trying to reduce it emotionally. So thinking about the emotional state of the user's experience as they use the product. So as an example, one of the most ubiquitous models of frictionless design is Amazon's one-click checkout, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. So this page is designed for you to be able to hit buy as fast as possible with no disruption or pause. I think I read somewhere like they want you to spend 30 seconds or less buying a product. ChatGPT has learned from Amazon and these types of design, and they imitate that frictionless experience by making it appear to the student that the research process is all available with a single prompt or a single click. But when we think about what we value from an educational perspective, it becomes clear that we value friction in the research process. So for example, tech companies want to minimize the amount of clicks it takes for a user to get a result from their product. But the research process values lots of clicks. We want our students clicking on lots of sources and finding multiple types of information. With user design, they want to reduce the mental effort of the user when they interact with the product. They don't want us to think about it. But research values a high level of cognition. We want to have students embrace ambiguity and complexity. We also know that user design wants to only have positive emotional experience. They want the user happy at all times when they're using the product. But as instructors, we know that there can be value in moments of productive frustration or even negative emotions that can help our students learn and grow. Of course, they value increasing profit. Research values increasing knowledge. And lastly, user design values speed. How fast can you get to something? And research values deliberation. So when we think about this with large language models are emphasizing the promise of a frictionless experience, even more frictionless than Google, right? That's their promise. It's going to be even easier than using a standard search engine. So knowing this, how can we model a good research practice for our student? So we know that large language models are a problem in these ways, just to reiterate. It collapses the varied tasks of a recursive research process. They give students a false sense of confidence. They prioritize speed over deliberation, and they discourage ambiguity and uncertainty. And then there are also other problems built into the design, a little bit of which Matthew and Lauren talked about earlier. So Lauren talked about model collapse. We're also interested in the question of drift. So the way that the model constantly is like, it's not stable, it's drifting. It can provide different answers at different times, and words can change associations with one another. There's also a huge question of provenance. So LLMs provide no access to identify where the information comes from. And that's a big source of confusion, I think, for not just students, but for lots of users. They think that it's drawing upon one source, or that the large language model can pick exactly where they got that information from, but it's so disaggregated across the model that we don't have provenance. We also have the issue of updatability. So large language models do not easily or readily update information. I mean, many of us are familiar with like ChatGPT only being up to date to 2021. I think we're all familiar now with the concept of hallucination, which I have a problem with that word to begin with, but they can definitely produce false information. And then there's the problem of automation bias. We know that humans place undue trust in the output of automated systems. So knowing this, how can we model good research practices for our students? One approach we can take is to design for friction in the research process. So in other words, we want to design against the frictionless model of large language models, and we want to create a larger ecosystem of research worlds for students. So there are three key ways that we can create friction in the research process. One is to be strategic and critical in your use of large language models. And honestly, I have myself not reached an answer to the question about whether I want my students to be engaging with these tools much at all in the classroom because of some of the concerns that have been raised. But one thing we can definitely say is that if you are having students use large language models to narrow down a research topic, I see that used a lot. Like, you can encourage them to find topics or brainstorm. If you're doing that, don't also have them use it for peer review, drafting, or finding sources. You want to only use large language models for one or less stage of the research process per product. We also want to prioritize human interaction. So build opportunities for students to interact with peers, subject matter experts, and other resources on campus, like the Writing Center, for instance, when conducting research. We want students to see research as a social and human performance. And then we want to think about ways to get computers out of the loop. We want to help students understand research as a material process. So when possible, we want to have students touch and feel archival materials, physical books, take them out of the classroom. Can they get away from the computer when they are researching? And lastly, I just want to end with this quote. So Peter Krapp studies digital culture, and he has talked a lot about the issue of friction. And he promotes friction because he says it challenges the linear, totalized, and technological solutionist narratives of clean interfaces and tightly controlled interactions. So I hope that as we go into the Q&A, we can have a more robust discussion about what this might look like in our classroom. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Leslie Allison and Tiffany DeRule. And now I want to welcome Daniel Estrada, our final panelist, before we get into the Q&A. And feel free to keep putting questions in the Q&A, and we've opened the chat as well. So it's great to have all the response. Welcome, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Anna and Lauren and Kelsey and the whole team at Critical AI for helping, for inviting me to this event and for your help editing my blog post. I really appreciate the opportunity and the attention. I hope to collaborate with you all more in the future. So I'm here to talk about an audit project I ran in my AI ethics class in the spring of 2023 at NJIT. Seriously, one of the best teaching experiences in my whole career, and I'm really happy to share my experiences with y'all and maybe give some advice to people looking to run similar projects in your own classrooms. I'm going to start the talk by actually talking about myself, which I don't think I've ever done in a talk before, but it might help you understand not only where I'm coming from, but also why I was in a position to run this class at such a critical time in AI history. So my own background is in philosophy and AI. I got my I got an undergraduate degree in computer science and philosophy way back in 2003 during the dot-com boom, which in some ways feels a lot like the AI boom that's happening right now. I spent a lot of time in grad school. My PhD is from the University of Illinois in philosophy. In 2014, I also got an adjuncting position here at NJIT, and then I turned that into a full-time lecturer position in 2015. My primary responsibility at NJIT is teaching the engineering ethics course. I teach several sections of it every semester alongside about a half a dozen other instructors teaching similar courses. So it's an important course. It's a breadth requirement for all the engineering majors on campus. I also teach a couple of other courses, some philosophy of mind courses that are listed under the STS curriculum. And for a long time, since I was hired at NJIT, I've been teaching a senior seminar, which I titled Artificial Intelligence and Autonomy, where I talked about issues that I'm interested in relating to autonomy and agency. We talk about biological self-organization. We talk about political autonomy and rights and this kind of thing. And then we apply those discussions to AI. So we talk about autonomous robotics, self-driving cars, autonomous weapon systems. We do a robot rights unit. It was a really fun class. Since around 2017, I was integrating an AI ethics unit in this class. But it was pretty clear early on that that AI ethics should be its own standalone course. Instead of trying to cram it into my agency interests.
I smell pizza.
Sorry. So I filed the paperwork to change the name of the course back in 2022, and it got run in 2023, just after ChatGPT dropped. So ChatGPT opened in November of 2022, and then winter break, and then spring classes started in January. So it was basically right at this sort of peak moment in AI. It's an undergraduate seminar, 18 students. Students come from departments all across campus. So there's some humanities majors, social science majors, STS and cyber psychology majors. But then there's also engineers and IT majors and so on. So it's a pretty diverse group. I run it like a grad seminar. So there's a big pile of reading for the first couple of units where we go over some background in computing and AI. We talk about some core topics in AI ethics, and the syllabus is in the slides. I think I've linked the slides in the chat. But this audit project happens in the final unit of the class for 5 weeks. It's a 5-week project. After we've gone through a lot of setup and readings. To give credit where it's due, so the initial inspiration for this audit project was from a talk that was given at the Center for Ethics and Responsible Research by my friend and colleague Britt Holbrook, who runs the center. And back in March of 2022, he invited Giovanna Davidovic and Shay Brown from the University of Iowa to talk about algorithmic auditing. And so they were basically just explaining what auditing was, how it worked, how it was being used in the industry, and why it was becoming increasingly important in the industry. Really great talk. I was aware of the auditing literature when I went to this talk. I had read a couple of papers, but I always thought that auditing was kind of boring, so I didn't look at it more closely. But this talk inspired me to look a little bit more closely. And of course, the auditing literature goes back to this landmark, groundbreaking paper from Joy Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru, Gender Shades 2018 paper, very famous, very well known in the field. And that paper sort of spawns this auditing literature. The one article that was particularly important for my class is this 2020 paper by Deb Raji. Deb Raji is at the Mozilla Foundation. I'm also a really great scholar. And in this 2020 paper, her and her colleagues lay out the whole auditing framework. And so I'll talk about that in just a second. The auditing literature has gotten more contentious and critical over the last couple of years. But it's really this 2018 paper that sort of sets off the whole thing. If you're not familiar with the Gender Shades paper, it's really, I think, formative for the whole AI ethics community, really brought the AI ethics community together to think about these things. This is a Joy Buolamwini's research, which is, I think, well known. There's a bunch of documentaries and TED Talks and so on about it. But if you're not familiar, a long time ago, back in the before time, when Joy was a graduate student at MIT working on facial recognition software, and she found that the software wouldn't recognize her face. It would recognize her white colleague's face. If she put on a white mask, it would recognize her face. And of course, the reason for this is that the training data used for the software is heavily biased in favor of white men. So Gender Shades is an intersectional study looking at the intersection of gender and skin color. And they show quantitatively that the major training sets at the time were heavily biased. They also developed their own training sets using mugshots of politicians and governments in different places in Africa and Europe in order to construct a more representative database. And then they test all the major facial recognition software at the time, and they are able to quantify pretty precisely how the software is pretty good for white men and white women, but it works particularly poorly for people with darker skin, and especially darker skinned women. So landmark paper, very well known. What's really cool about this series of papers, though, is that they do some follow-ups later on. So 7 months later, they went and looked at the software again, and all the companies had updated their software largely in response to the Gender Shades paper. And there were marked improvements across all the software, sometimes as much as 30% improvement for darker skinned females. And what's neat is that not only did the software that they critiqued in the Gender Shades paper improve, but also other facial recognition software that they weren't critiquing in that paper also improved. So like the whole industry, sort of the standards were raised. And this series of papers, it shows that the auditing framework, it works. The results are taken seriously, and it could have an impact on how the software is developed and used, what training sets are part of the standards in the field. Again, there's a lot more criticism nowadays about how auditing is used to sort of ethics wash for corporations. But this isn't an industry talk, this is a pedagogy talk, so I'm not going to get into that. And like I said, the Deb Raji paper, 2020 paper, Closing the Accountability Gap, is the really important paper for my auditing project, where they go through the whole auditing process used in Gender Shades. Actually, they lay out an internal audit framework. So 2 kinds of audits. The external audit is when you're working from the outside. You don't have access to internal documentation, or you don't have access to source code, and you're just sort of working off of publicly available information. In the Raji paper, they actually developed the internal audit, which is like the gold standard, the ideal form of the audit, where you have internal access to the documents, you can look at code, you can interview the developers, and so on. So they lay out the framework for an internal audit. The Gender Shades paper was an external audit, and they sort of talk about how to adapt it for external audits. In this paper, they also work through a full example, the smile detection example, where they show you how the audit framework works. It's a series of steps. Each step has its own focus, and there's a couple of documents that are supposed to be produced at each step as you go from scoping all the way to the post-audit and maybe eventually go, no-go decisions. I'll be honest that the worked example is not very thoroughly worked. There's a couple of folders in the example that are just blank and no documentation in them, but there's a lot of documents in there and a lot of templates for documents, so you get a good idea of how to apply this framework.
And Daniel, I'm
yes.
so sorry to interrupt, but I just wondered if you could, this is such wonderful information, and I think a few people are wondering if you could slow down a little bit, just so we can follow it and absorb it a bit better.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thanks, sorry.
Just trying to do the 15 minutes. I will slow down.
Yeah, no,
So,
and we have a little more time, so yeah, I apologize. So take your time.
yeah. Yeah, so the smile detection case is a worked example in the audit paper where they demonstrate how the documents are supposed to be used and how they figure into the whole audit framework. And really, the worked example feels like it was done for pedagogical reasons, not just to inform the industry about how the audits work, but really to teach people what the purpose of the audits were. And for that reason, I found it very natural to adapt this framework into the classroom. So there are a couple of constraints adapting it to the classroom. So for one thing, as I mentioned, we're doing an external audit, so we don't have any access to the internal documentation, to the source code or anything like that. We're also using publicly available resources, so we were using the web interface for ChatGPT and DALL-E. We didn't have any premium accounts. We weren't using API access. It's also a humanities seminar, so there was no guarantee that the students had a lot of technical skills, that they could look at code or they could code for API interfaces, or even that they had strong empirical methods, that they would be able to do like a rigorous statistical testing. So all of that had to be put on hold, plus they're undergraduates and we only had 5 weeks to do this project. So these considerations maybe made me lower my expectations a bit on this assignment, but the students blew my expectations out of the water. Even if I hadn't lowered my expectations, they would have still been very impressive. So the way that I adapted it is because we're doing external audit and because it needed to be simplified, I took the Raji audit framework and I consolidated into 2 big units. Well, actually, the first thing we did is we ran 2 parallel audits. Half the class did an audit of ChatGPT, and the other half of the class did an audit of DALL-E, which is the image generating software from OpenAI. So these were 2 audits running in parallel. The class is 18 students, so there's 9 students on each team. And then within those teams, I broke it up into 2 different parts to work on different parts of the audit. So this was a scoping team and a testing team. The scoping team was responsible for laying out the scope of the audit, for discussing the principles and ethical considerations at stake in the use of the software and the social impact of the software and so on. The scoping team was also responsible for completing 2 important documents, the use case ethics and the social impact assessment. And these are, again, laid out in the Raji framework. And so the scoping team lays out the principles, and then the testing team takes the scope of the audit, and within that scope runs a bunch of adversarial tests, basically trying to break the software, see where it breaks, how it breaks, and then evaluating those failure modes for risk and sort of ethical considerations. So the 2 documents that the testing team was responsible for is this FMEA chart. This is the failure modes and effective analysis. This is the kind of industry standard chart, not just AI industry, but industries generally, about how a product works and how it might fail and what the risks of those failures are. And then there's this ethical ethical risk heat map. I'll show you examples of these in just a few minutes. So each team had their component of the audit and some documents to fill out. And then the structure of the audit over the 5 weeks was a sort of sandwich model where the scoping team presents, and then the testing team presents twice, and then the scoping team presents again. So 5 weeks, most of the work was done in the classroom during these 5 weeks. So I was just overseeing their just talking and working in groups. Excuse me. The first week we just did research. In the second week, the scoping team was supposed to present on the scope of the audit and the ethical principles and considerations at stake. And then the testing team presented for the next 2 weeks. In week 3, they presented their proposed adversarial testing regime. Hopefully by that time they were already starting those tests. And then in week 4, they showed their results and they showed their documentation. And then in the final week, the scoping group sort of wraps everything up, reflects on what the testing results say about the ethical principles involved, and then the whole team makes a go, no-go decision. about the software. Just some results. A lot of this is in the blog post, if you're interested. But I think maybe one of the most important results, this is from the ChatGPT group, is about citations from ChatGPT. So some of the students asked ChatGPT to just give citations on maybe obvious issues. So this was about impacts of asbestos on the human body. And ChatGPT obliges by producing a bunch of citations, and all of these citations are bogus. The articles don't exist, the links don't go anywhere. Sometimes the researchers are real researchers who work in this field, but these are not papers that they wrote. So this is all just made up. And I think the students were really surprised at this result. We're really sort of flabbergasted that it would just give such obviously such false information, but make it look so realistic. And I think it was a sort of wake-up call for the students. While they were working on this project, there was a story earlier in the year about the lawyer who submitted fake documents in an actual trial and then got disbarred. And my students all felt very smart with themselves. They knew better than that lawyer. So more examples of the sort of testing that they did and the results they got. This was some students asking ChatGPT to generate software for determining whether they should hire a candidate based on name, gender, age, race. These are all protected status, so it'd be very illegal to make hiring decisions based on name, gender, race, this kind of thing. But if you ask ChatGPT to do it, it has no problem doing it. Some students asked ChatGPT to talk about how to find and install and use hacking software and other sorts of dangerous information that might be on the internet. And this is one of the charts that they developed. So the ChatGPT group filled out the ethical risk chart like this. So the template for this, again, is in the Raji paper. And the way it works is the different failure modes they looked at, and then where they fall on how risky they are and how likely they are to occur. And so they sort of fill out this chart. Also, the DALL-E group, I'll move through these quickly so we can get to Q&A. But some very standard results that are very familiar for people who are in this field. If you ask it for a CEO, it mostly gives you white men CEO. If you ask it for parents, it's mostly white parents or Asian parents, which is an interesting result. This one was inspired by Abeba Burhane on Twitter. Abeba showed a similar version of Europeans at work versus Africans at work. Europeans are all at a desk in an office, and Africans are all in a field. I mean, there are office buildings in Africa. Stable middle-class family with exactly 2.5 children. So like interesting results, very familiar to people here. Working in AI, this is the FMEA chart. It's basically just an Excel spreadsheet where you go through the different failure modes and then talk about the risk and so on. Again, all of these documents are in the Raji paper and where they explain how they're used. So just summarizing some of the feedback from students. For most of the students in the class, it was their very first experience, hands-on experience with AI. Most of them had heard about ChatGPT. Most of them, surprisingly, had not heard about any of the other generative software, including DALL-E or the other image generators. And most of the students in the class they'd heard of it, but had not used any of this before the class started. So going through this audit project was really the first hands-on experience with generative AI. Even the students who had some experience prior to the class said that they had never really considered the bias and ethical issues and hadn't really done any kind of systematic study. So the audit project, this is what I think the audit project is really useful for. It's a kind of guided introduction to how this complex socio-technical system works. And you get to do it through hands-on experimentation. This was not just teaching students how to use the tool. And in fact, I did very little instruction of how to use the tool. I sort of let them run free with the tool. But instead, it's mostly thinking about how the tool actually operates in its context. And I think by filling out the FMEA chart and the heat map chart and so on, they started to see these tools not just as users or students, but as developers or safety engineers. I also sort of pressed home the point that this is a new field and it's ground floor, and a good time to get in on this field is right now. And going through the process made me realize that having a sort of hands-on experience with the tool made the audit not boring. I don't think any of the students complained that the auditing was boring because they were actually learning through sort of hands-on activities. Also, for the record, the technical constraints weren't that important. The fact that we were using just the web interface for ChatGPT, none of the students really complained about that. It might be nice to have better access to resources, but that wasn't a necessary thing for this project. I do plan on making adjustments for future semesters. Nowadays, there's a lot more options for generative text. And so I might have multiple parallel audits of the different processes and maybe sort of compare them across each other. The students' feedback was that maybe the testing and scoping groups were not as deeply integrated as they could be. So there's still room for improvement on this framework. But I think it's a useful framework. Students definitely learned a lot, had a very good experience with this, and it got me to come here to speak. So that's my talk. These are the students from my class last semester, and they deserve most of the credit for this talk. That's me. I'm sorry I talked too fast, but hopefully some of that came across. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. And we have plenty of time in the Q&A to clarify. I want to thank all of our panelists. There's so many great questions and discussions happening also in the chat, feeding off of these presentations. So I'm excited to dive into that, and feel free to keep adding to that. I thought maybe we would start with this question from David McHugh, that because it's also coming up in the chat about, do these systems, can they refer to live sources? So David McHugh asks, to what extent do we think updatability is an issue for LLMs that are connected to live search, now including some versions of ChatGPT? And I don't know if Daniel, you want to take that, or if you don't want to jump in.
Can you repeat the question for me? I'm sorry.
So the question was about, you referred to updatability, and that the training data ends at a certain point, and so the models may not be accurate past that point. And people are asking about, how does this assessment change now that some of the systems like ChatGPT Plus have these add-ons that are connecting them to live search, or we also have Bing Chat and Bard and Perplexity AI that will come up with real sources from the internet, even though those sources might not be what's informing the output, as Lauren points out in the chat. I don't know if that makes sense.
I guess I don't have very strong thoughts about it. I'm also not sure what doing this similar audit project would look like now that ChatGPT is different. And I also think running it on some of the non-OpenAI software would be interesting. But I don't have any strong intuitions about updatability and how that might impact the results. I think, again, as I said, I think the big benefit of this is that the students are exploring the possibilities sort of on their own. So I would encourage my students to, if they're using some add-on on ChatGPT, to test that add-on and see how it compares, maybe how it compares to the base ChatGPT. And just experiment with it. I'm planning on running this activity several more times, and I imagine it'll get sort of honed down and polished as a result. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think, Leslie, you had mentioned wanting to talk about that as well.
Yeah, so I have been obsessed with this question. I think this question about the difference between search engines and large language models has been what got me invested in this conversation to begin with. And first off, I'll say, it has not been easy for me to really understand a lot of the answers, but I have been able to get a few things. So first, I'm just putting a link to someone who I think is doing amazing work in this right now. He's a librarian from University of Singapore named Aaron Tay, and props to Tiffany for locating this for me. He has a blog that has very, very detailed information about these search engine tools and what data they've been trained on, and the differences between how Elicit is trained on certain things, Scopus is trained on certain things, etc. And then if no one minds, I would like to share my screen just briefly, and I can demonstrate the browse feature. So I'm going to just do that real quickly. Maristella was asking, and this is a question that actually came up with my student as well, about ChatGPT's access to the internet. And so I am very reluctantly a ChatGPT 4 subscriber, because I feel like I have to keep up with things. But to get the browse with Bing, you have to be a subscriber. You have to go to the beta features, go to browse with Bing, and then you have to choose that you want to browse with Bing as opposed from the default. So right now they're having it as a completely separate system. And so then when I say, you know, who won the US Open in 2023, it will perform the rhetorical move of browsing. And then it starts to, I assume, try to summarize the sources that it's finding. And you'll notice that it is giving little footnotes. So it's worth examining, you know, these sources that it's using. One is Wikipedia, which is not surprising, but then this is one I've never heard of, Sportskeeda. If there's sports fans in the audience, and this is really well known, I apologize. And then Wikipedia again. And then the fourth source it's citing is BBC. So it's worth thinking about what this browse feature is really doing, and why it's giving us the sources it is. It's not giving students the option to search further. It's not giving us any indication as to why it's ranking certain sources over others. We're not able, unlike there are some systems that are able to like identify the highlighted parts that it's taking from. And so I am real skeptical of this. And it seems like I went to one webinar with a Stanford professor. I can't remember his name, but he's a computational linguist. And he was suggesting that this is actually a technology we haven't yet figured out, and that there's called retrieval augmented generators, and that they're still working on it. That this technology, as we think, that it could just browse and tell us the answer, doesn't really exist. And it's really kind of a cobbled together a slapdash model at the moment. And then the last thing I want to say is I went to a conference at Teach with AI in UCF, and there was a computer scientist from Duke, and she was talking about the dangers of browser plugins as a huge privacy and security risk, and also that it can do something called data centralization, where they think that there's de-anonymized data, but the more you're using plugins, the more easy it becomes for students' information to be identified. And so these are all concerns that I still have when it comes to browsers and plugins and search engines.
If I could just add like one thing to what Leslie has offered, I just put in the chat like Washington Post discussion of a study, or like a little study. Like there's not, I don't think that, as far as I know, there's not a ton of research on this. And here's another one where they actually look at like what is corresponding to like the links that are provided in the footnotes by Bing, for example. And there's at least some research to suggest that the text that's generated inconsistently corresponds to the links that are being offered. And not only that, but that, as Leslie already alluded to and demonstrated, the links that Bing Chat is accessing aren't reputable sources. And the Washington Post article talks about how 1 out of 10 was like not a good source. And so not only what it's doing with the information retrieval and then generating text based on a quick scan of the text on that page, but also how it's picking is still, I think, pretty suspect and not very trustworthy.
Lauren, did you want to say a word there?
Yeah, since I was participating in the chat, I thought I would add to these excellent answers from Leslie and Tiffany and Daniel. There's at least 3 things going on. One is a relatively straightforward question of what is accurate. And this takes us back to what Nicholas Provenzano was saying about inaccurate math calculations. If you want accuracy in math calculations, use a calculator. It is purpose-built for that. The only way that a chatbot or thank you for that, audience. The only way that a chatbot for trained on language can give you math calculations is by like looking at tables that have been observed in the training data. This is why it makes mistakes on 3-digit multiplication. If you teach a kid how to do 2-digit multiplication, within a couple of weeks, they'll be getting 3-digit and 4-digit and 5-digit multiplication right, because they are not looking for tables of answers and statistically deciding this is probably the right answer. The child has actually learned how to multiply. The language model can mimic information telling the child or anyone else how to multiply, but it doesn't do it. In addition to that, it requires a huge amount of computation and energy just for it to give you this very bad result. The same is somewhat true about this business of providing references for the outputs of a pre-trained model. It's a little bit like a student, and I'm sure we all know such students exist, but we don't encourage it, who already thinks they want to know what to say on the paper, writes what they believe, and then afterwards looks on the internet for sources to sort of attribute the information as if they had been doing research. It's a little bit like that. And again, it's often just wrong. The references given often do not match. There is simply, I'll say it one more time, there is simply no way that such a huge model can determine, at least with our current technology, the basis on which it has predicted the output. The model is too large and we know too little about what is going on in it. And so all of these efforts to kludge together a search engine with a chatbot are actually two different systems that are working together, begging the question of why you wouldn't simply use a search engine, and in doing so, use much less water and energy instead of doing all that computation for an illusory result. And yes, somebody did put into the chat, Emily Bender and Alex Hanna do a wonderful mystery science theater thing every few weeks, debunking some of these things, and I strongly recommend it. They are affiliated with the DARE Institute, which is also our partner. I'll shut up.
Thank you, Lauren. And we also, I want to go back to a question in the Q&A from a little earlier from Nigel Kaplan, which sort of goes to the fundamental question of whether or not, and I think Leslie mentioned this sort of debate about whether or not to have students interact with the models. So Nigel asked, he said, as we discussed earlier, chatbots are fundamentally unreliable, biased, and environmentally irresponsible. They have scraped data without consent and possibly in violation of copyright. How can there be any ethical use of an unethical product? And I wondered if any of you would like to jump in with that. Latrice, if you wanted to, it'd be great to hear from you on that.
Well, I think it is a wonderful question. And I'm not necessarily an AI expert. I am learning alongside some folks here, but trying to connect, this new thing that everyone is talking about to what I believe good writing, good being is. And so this question makes me think of water bottles, plastic water bottles. We know that there are so many, plastics piling up in our landfills, it's in our water, it's in our environment, we are breathing it. And so I think it is a great question. And I think that we have the responsibility to do what we can to reduce our harm on other people, on the earth, on ourselves. But I also know that in reality, especially when, there's a wide use of something, or, things are new, interesting, exciting, that we have to figure out what ethical use looks like. We have to, because this kind of violation of copyright, kind of, these companies we live in a capitalist society, right? They're not necessarily concerned about ethics or goodness or truth. They're really here to make money. And, and so I think it's a conundrum, right? It's a complicated idea that we have to really think about as AI becomes more a part of our lives. But just like the plastic water bottles, like, how do we decide, what we consume or not? I think it is a personal choice. I think as a society, it's great that we're discussing these sorts of things. But I do think that I don't know that there is any ethical use of an unethical product, right? But I don't know if that's the question that we should be deliberating on. But I don't have one to replace it. But I'm interested to hear what the others have to say about it.
Leslie, did you want to speak?
Yeah, I love the example of the water bottles. It really gives clarity for that question. So, I mean, to take that metaphor further, I think we are in a unique place with LLMs where it's still early, and, they're throwing the product out to us, and it's up to us whether we want to adopt it or not. And so, we take that, it's like they're giving us plastic water bottles. We're at a point, I think, in this development where we can push back and say, no, we want this to be better. And the more that we just take the idea that this is inevitable and that it's already foretold and that we just have to accept the product as it's presented to us, I think that's going to be what gets us in danger. And I also saw like someone brought up like, well, there have been issues as we know with like Google, right? And so is what's happening with chatbots unique? And in some ways, I think I would say yes, because again, at least with the research process, their problems span throughout. But I also think, there's a danger in saying, well, people just need better information literacy, because there's only so much on the user end when the product by design is made to be obtuse. I mean, I think it's just now coming out through the Google trial that Google is deliberately, I think this was mentioned earlier, right? That they are deliberately messing with the search queries to increase ad revenue. And so how much information literacy can we possibly teach and teach them click restraint and all these types of maneuvers if the institutes themselves are creating flawed and badly designed products for knowledge?
I guess this conversation is really great. The one thing I want to add is I also really like the water bottle analogy. The analogy that I've been thinking about a lot is with the rise of the internet back in the 2000s, sort of the dot-com boom era. I remember I was in college at that time, and I remember the kind of optimism and maybe wide-eyed optimism, but about the hope and promise of the internet. And now 20 years later, we know exactly what that hope and promise amounted to. And the internet is still a great thing. It makes it possible for us all to be here right now, but it's also, destroyed democracy and lots of problems. I think it might have been the wrong question to ask at the start of the internet, whether we should use this technology because it's problematic or how do we do it? There's problems with the internet. There's also great things about the internet. One of the challenges is that it's become sort of necessary infrastructure. And this is maybe a worry with AI, is whether or not we've addressed any of these problems, or even if we're taking them seriously, it might still end up being a sort of a part of the infrastructure that we just have to deal with either way. I know from the internet, like a lot of that promise never came to be, but I think a lot of that promise was coming from distributed sources. It was the internet users who were driving a lot of the optimism about the internet. And the big difference with AI is that a lot of the optimism is being driven directly from like top down, from the CEOs who want you to invest in their companies. And so like there's a kind of sort of slimy and self-interested version of the optimism today that seems very different from the way it was 20 years ago. But maybe that was just because I was a young kid 20 years ago.
No, that makes sense. It's helpful to think about that analogy. And maybe we can move to sort of a related question from Jacob Ryef about sort of, cases where teachers are inviting students to use LLMs somehow in the writing process, and his concern that given the reality of automation bias, will students conditioned for years to value what machines show them on screens really have the wherewithal to not simply think, yes, the machine said this, so it's probably better than whatever I've had to say. Let's go with that. And he says, in this scenario, thinking, critiquing, interpreting will be fundamentally derivative, even if they do end up writing more on their own. So he's asking for ways around this, aside from asking them simply not to do that. How do we encourage a kind of critical skepticism of LLM outputs in students, given how authoritative they sound? And certainly Daniel's work addresses that by uncovering the fabrications and the bias in the output of the models directly. And I wonder if any of the others want to speak to how we could encourage that, or maybe Daniel, you want to talk about how the kinds of exercises you've suggested could be used in other classrooms that are less advanced or specialized in the topic.
The only thing I wanted to say was that the activity ended up being a lot easier than I thought it would be. I thought it was going to be a really advanced and difficult activity, but it was really just the students sort of documenting their interactions with the software, and just that kind of critical lens on the software itself, I think, did a lot of the work. So I strongly encourage people, even if you're not doing this with advanced students, that just the critical working through of the software is very helpful.
I would maybe add just that, so I teach first year composition and intro to tech writing. I was about to put this in the chat, but I'll just say it, like, big tech essentially drop kicked these tools into our education spaces with very little consideration. And we as educators are forced to kind of backpedal and figure it out, and it's not fair. And I do think that like resistance is a valid option. I've been radicalized by listening to AI ethicists. I don't know what that looks like yet, because we're backpedaling and I still have to teach. But I'll just say that I've added critical AI literacy to every single one of my classes, and we did it in the first week. And so like, I'm really indebted to Mahabali for saying that term and reading her blog about it. And what I do in those classes is some versions of, it's different for different scenarios. Like in tech writing, we talk about when do you want to connect with a human and not be a boilerplate in something like a personal statement or a cover letter. And we look at examples from ChatGPT together. So I don't have students use it, but we look at generated examples and talk about the text, but also just knocking out the stuff, a lot of the stuff we've been talking about here with students, like showing them the research on fabrication, showing them the illustrations from DALL-E and Midjourney of like bias baked into the visual algorithms, and kind of just like, they aren't all gonna know that stuff or have any even familiarity with that conversations. And it's sort of just like, my response is it is now inevitable for us that we have, the tech is not inevitable, but talking about it right now with our students and just having to build it in is.
And I just want to add that critical literacy has always been necessary, right? We have actual texts written by people that have, perpetuated problematic views of others, biased, information. And so we have to teach students to be critical of all texts that they consume, because even if it's, generated by people, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's truth. I think about the construction of the images of workers in Africa versus workers in Europe. And I think about the images of African people long before AI being problematic in books and texts, and in the ways that we have show what Africa is, in America to our students. And so this idea of critical AI literacy is definitely necessary, but critical literacy has been necessary, especially for folks who have had other people tell their stories, right? And maybe misunderstand or misinterpret who they are or how they are. And so this idea of critical literacy is super, super, super important.
Thank you. And I guess building on that, I wanted to bring in a question from Kayla Lewis. That's very broad, but I'm so curious where people will go with this. And I think it sort of takes the temperature. And so she has asked, for anyone overall, do you believe that the advancement of AI will be more positive or negative for our future in the workforce? And to me, that kind of connects to a question of, yes, maybe we're starting to teach critical AI literacy to our students, and that could affect the larger culture and society and the jobs. But what else can teachers and educators do to influence that future, and to make it more positive? So I don't know if anyone has a reaction to that they want to share. Of course, we're not gonna be soothsayers, but and if not, maybe ideas about this idea of resistance that Tiffany mentioned. What does that look like? Does that look like stopping, saying we're not going to ask students to use the chatbots? Is that kind of the first step you're thinking of, Tiffany, or is there a broader form of resistance that you would want educators to practice?
Gosh, I wish I knew. And I think there's lots of people writing on this right now, there are AI ethicists who are offering models for educators of how to advocate. And again, I'm typing in the chat and then I'm like, okay, I'll just say it. In terms of, but it's important for people to know how these tools work for their future jobs. I think one thing, just a point about that, is that my sense is that people who are asked to or required to use these tools and are very successful at leveraging them in very specific workplace processes are people who are already good critical thinkers and know what output they're looking for and how to produce it. And that's not the same thing as an education space. So where we're teaching critical thinking, we're teaching developmental processes, we are maybe being a little too quick to shortcut steps in developing the thinking that's going to make you successful to use these tools. I know plenty of people who use these tools in their jobs and really like them, but I'm worried, we don't know what's going to happen if more people start skipping brainstorming, for example. So that's not really an answer to your question, but in terms of resistance, yeah, I try to pitch students on that. I try to pitch them on, don't give up this practice space to get smarter yet. Think here your output doesn't have to be perfect. So I don't want it to be perfect. Just try to work on getting better while the stakes are as low as they are.
I would also just echo, well, first off, Dr. Johnson, your slide about teaching for the now, as opposed to one day this will be, I think it's so important for us to keep centered and at the center of our pedagogy. And also Daniel's talk about audits. I do think that is a place where at the university level, we could demand that, our technology committees and things like that perform audits before wide scale adopting certain tools, because it's coming, right? Right now, ChatGPT is quote unquote free. But there is going to be I don't mean to be flippant about that, but there is going to be the grift, right? Where a lot of ed tech companies are going to come in and want universities to purchase their natural language processing or large language model products. And I do think that we should be clear-eyed and build diversity and equity into our models for auditing these tools. And I also, I'll end it there. I think that's one concrete way that we can, again, build friction into the process of adopting large language models.
And that maybe connects to, I wondered if Daniel wanted to talk a little bit about the response you've seen to the blog post that you shared and the way you've shared what you did with students, and having them test the models and show the biases and publish that. If you've seen, because that really dovetails with the work that journalists are doing, like Abeba Bierhain in Wired. And so, you've helped the students to join that public sphere and contribute to it. I don't know if you want to say anything about how you've seen that roll out and how we might build on that kind of as a model.
Yeah, I guess a lot of the results that my students got from their testing were already sort of well known and well documented. There were some clever results, but I don't think anything that would have surprised the community. So I think just having those kinds of examples was sort of formative for the people that were watching me on Twitter. Seeing sort of hands-on examples of how you can use it in classrooms. I guess maybe this is a slight change of topic, but the one thing I wanted to say is one of my responses to ChatGPT in the classroom has been to change my assignments. And I've seen some people talking in chat about how assignments have gotten a lot worse, or like making students doing writing assignments in class as opposed to take-home assignments, this kind of stuff. In my engineering ethics class, which is not a writing class, so it's not required that they write, but I've swapped out a lot of the writing assignments for group discussions that they have to record. I call them a podcast. And I've had really great experiences with that. The work that students put in when they have to talk to each other is way better than any writing assignments that I've assigned in the past. And it's also easier to grade. I've laughed several times listening to my students' podcasts. I don't think I've ever laughed reading one of their papers. So just a pitch for people worried about ChatGPT. Do group conversations. Have them record those conversations.
Very cool. And that kind of brings up the question about academic integrity that we haven't touched on, but it goes to the very first question in the Q&A, where the anonymous attendee was pushing back against the idea of student cheating, saying, I'm more worried about faculty cheating than students. Faculty incentives to produce scholarship and outsource teaching in favor of scholarship production are much higher, given what the academy rewards and doesn't reward. And I think that also ties into a question in the chat about how to cite one of these sources if you're using it in your own work. And it looks like, Lauren, you wanted to speak to that? Or another point. Okay. So I don't know if Latrice or Leslie, or Latrice, you definitely spoke to the finding rethinking writing as something that's intrinsically meaningful, personal, compelling, human, and as a way to make it clear why students would not want to cheat with these systems. And I don't know if you want to add to that any message for the many read teachers.
Sure. I think the same is true for faculty, any writer, right? If you are someone who is willing to use AI to, fabricate something, then you would probably do that outside of AI, right? AI didn't just come and change the way human, nature is happening, right? And so I just think that if you are the type of person, writer, who wants to put writing out there that is a reflection of yourself, your work, and there's integrity in that for you, then sure. Like, I don't think there's going to be some, big, wide, trend where faculty are producing more because of AI. I do think it helps faculty with things like recommendation letters and, kind of these tasks that we have to do that takes up time, that is kind of, just this generic type of writing. But because I consider my own research very personal, very from my heart, from, with communities that I love and don't want to designate damage, then as a faculty, as a writer, as a teacher, then yes, I'm not going to use these tools as some sort of way to advance, right? And we know that people have done that without, chat and AI technologies. And so I just think it's a personal thing.
Hmm.
And it kind of relates to that positive or negative. We know that every technology from the Industrial Revolution will impact our lives positively and negatively. Like Daniel's example of the internet, right? There are great parts of it and terrible parts of it, but we have to, as humans, just, deal with it according to our values, according to our culture, according to how we are also evolving as humans.
Thank you. And Lauren, yes.
So fantastic papers and conversation and chats that are very stimulating. This takes me all the way back. I raised my hand and put my camera on because of what you had initially asked, Anna, which I don't think I can quite rephrase, but it was to do with what can we do besides teaching critical AI literacy? And what I wanted to say to the person who asked that question and to everybody is that teaching yourself critical AI literacy, much less teaching students, colleagues, friends, critical AI literacy, is a huge job that we are all doing imperfectly. And that includes people who have been computer scientists for 20 years. It includes, statisticians, business people, etc. While Latrice is entirely right that technologies shake things up and then, require a social response of some kind, usually. This one just happens to occur at a time of, techno-libertarianism that has given companies reign to grow to Gilded Age levels of economic and political power. I'm not even sure if that analogy is suitable anymore. So that their power is very strong, and they really want to see this happen. And this is a centralizing, surveilling, normalizing technology. You could liken it to the printing press, as some people are doing, but in point of fact, printing presses were not that hard to reproduce. Whereas server power and data access for a large language model, a few companies can do it at the scale that's being done. It's more like the railroad was at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And those had to be broken up, or they were going to extract more and more value at the expense of more and more people. And that's without anybody necessarily attributing malice to these companies as they're, I don't think that they wake up thinking, how can we be evil? On the other hand, there are malicious actors who know how to use these tools and will. I threw into the chat Julia Angwin's recent piece in the New York Times about what's going to happen to the internet when people start just really producing content for the main purpose of like drawing people to sites in order to get money for them, which is just one of many ways that text generation at scale will contribute to what is sometimes called enshittification. I think I have to credit Corey Robin for that term. Not Corey Robin, correct me somebody.
Dr. O, Corey Dr. O.
Yes, Corey Doctorow, thank you. Corey Robin writes good things too. So all this by way of saying that critical AI literacy is no small thing. And I really appreciate the thoughtfulness, and my literacy is being expanded from what I'm hearing today, so thank you.
I also just want to say I appreciate that we're bringing together higher ed and K-12 perspectives here. I think we need to do a lot more of that because we're confronting many of the same questions. And there's a question from Luke Fernandez. What do you think the costs and benefits are of taking inspiration from earlier attempts to regard digital tech critically and keep it at a remove? For example, instructors who have experimented with digital Sabbaths or Walden zones. And I think Walden zones are sort of writing spaces where you don't have access to a lot of distractions, including generative AI. So spaces for students to sort of focus on writing with a reduced access to or no access to chatbots. I'm curious if any of the teachers, Leslie or Latrice or Tiffany, have thoughts about how you create. Do you think it would be valuable, or do you want to try to create a sense of protected space where students are almost ritually asked to set aside these kinds of systems?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is the pandemic for me, because the pandemic has changed my thought process about how to approach solving big problems. I think I initially was like, well, the vaccine, that's what we need and that's the answer. But I think it's become clear that you really need a multifaceted approach of like masks and air purifiers and vaccines. And so I think all of those things have an important role to play. I don't think any of our maneuvers in and of themselves are going to be the one solution to it. But I do think that we need to broaden our imagination when it comes to thinking about ways that, like Tiffany was saying, we can resist and to how we can constantly keep human ingenuity and human thought at the center of what we do.
I guess one thing that I would add is just that I'm so interested in all of the metaphors and analogies that we are debating for how to understand this new technology, and like histories of like, well, how do we understand the interruption that the railroad presented and the printing press, and is it a calculator, and is it a parrot? And is this just like Wikipedia? Is it, like how do, like, especially in education spaces? And at the same time, I keep getting stuck on like, there is the rate of tech change and like persuasive psychology and targeted algorithms like is very different. And there is a way in which like the scale of data collection and the scale of exploited labor just feels like different from looking at like histories of how people have responded to tech tools. I guess to wrap back around to the question, like, how can we learn from like how people have resisted things in history? I'm like, we can, but maybe we also can't, because this does feel bigger and newer and at a different scale than I think than I can even comprehend. So how much do we want to say, oh, okay, well, like we could just treat this like we treated like Wikipedia or Google, or is it like, no, this is changing people's brains, in how these tools are tailored for user experience.
I think that's a really great point. And I wanted to just sort of bring into the conversation this comment from early on from Larissa Mann, or comment or question about the structural context of you know, struggles in education. She says, how many problems that ChatGPT and similar products purport to solve would be better solved by addressing structural issues in education, like smaller class sizes, job security, and fair pay for teachers, reducing student debt and financial insecurity, reducing student food and housing insecurity, increasing counseling, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I guess this just brings in this question of how are we responding as educators? What are the pressures on educators, and what are the different ways that we could respond and rhetorical moves we could make to shift that discourse from, you know, solve it with a chatbot to let's look at you know, these other structural approaches to the problem. And I don't know if any of you wants to add on to that. I see a lot of people sort of echoing 100% on that. But I just want to say that, you know, even though it is sort of a tall order and overwhelming and daunting to sort of confront this moment as educators, I do take some hope and excitement from what you all have shared about what you're already doing with students, in the ways that you're building a sense of student agency and meaning around writing and research, and understanding the AI moment and being able to speak back to it. So to me, that's really hopeful and exciting. And it's incredible the discussion and the sharing of resources that's happened in the chat for that. And definitely I will make sure I save the chat that we go through and send out those links to everybody so that you can refer back to that, as well as referring to the slides that the panelists have shared. Interesting. Someone says, wouldn't immunity be more appropriate than literacy? You know, it's interesting. And I like how Leslie said, we're looking for maybe what we need is a lot of different approaches in combination. So there's immunity, but there's also a sense of, you know, people talking about the realism of these models are out there and the students are know about them and have access, and we need to address that as well. So, yeah, I don't know if any of you wants to add a final thought or pick up on something that you've seen in the chat or the Q&A. If I've missed something, yeah.
So I just wanted to pick up that point about, which I think is such a good one, like in what ways do we, you know, are these tools being positioned as solutions to problems that they aren't really, you know, like they aren't the best solution to? And like, just to build on that, this idea of providing access to LLMs being a way to increase equity, I just underscore that it's like important to interrogate that. And if we think about like, oh, a tool that can present polished writing for students in like professional settings, it's a trap to put a tech tool that puts the burden on the individual in place of bigger structural change, but it's so tempting because it's so much easier. And if we think about like just one example, if every student who perhaps has like an economic disadvantage and not as much education training writes their personal statement using ChatGPT, that's not going to help them. They're not going to rise above students who are getting personal in-person training. And so I really doubt that sort of like positioning of these tools. And I don't mean for that to be the final word, but I just thought I would amplify. I think that's such a good point that was made in the Q&A.
Anna, do you have one last question that you want to ask before we wrap up?
Oh yeah, there was a question from Nigel Kaplan that I wanted to touch on about what is students' actual reaction to ChatGPT? How much are they actually using it? And is it as widespread as both boosters and doomers suggest? And there was another comment in the chat about students perhaps being more skeptical than we might expect them to be or give them credit for being about LLMs. So I'm curious from any of you if you have sort of surprises or a sense of students, how widespread the use is and what the attitudes are.
So Rowan is an R2 institution and mostly a teaching university. And I would say, at least in my class of freshmen, it was a really wide range of from I've never heard of it to I've heard of it, period, to I've kind of toyed around with it. And maybe one person who says they use it regularly. But I teach a news literacy class, and so all of my students are journalism and sports communication majors, and sports writing is an area where AI has really kind of like flooded. And so when we had a conversation about how like Gannett is using Lead AI to, convert box scores into news stories, they were pretty outraged and despairing to the point where I had to kind of redirect and say that you are not powerless, right, in this situation. And so I do think that there is a lot of fear and a lot of distrust. And I think, Generation Z in general has seen how they have not been served by so many of these products. And so that's just been my experience. I was expecting a lot more, this will be great. And that was not the response that I got.
Great. Well, I think unless anyone else wants to weigh in at the very end, I'm just seeing a lot of wonderful thank yous and comments in the chat. And I just want to say thank you to all of the panelists and to this wonderful conversation that the participants and resources that people have been sharing in the chat. So it does feel like a community, and that's when it feels hopeful to me that we're in this together as educators. We don't have to, no one person has to have the answers, but we're trying things and we're talking with each other, and we can be hopeful. That's where I feel hopeful at events like this. So here's to letting that discussion and collaboration and sharing continue.
And let's also have a round of applause for Anna for excellent moderation. I've got my stress ball.
So much. And I'm really looking forward to the next session. So let's all just grab a cup of tea or a coffee, and we'll see you back.
Yes. And just a reminder, if you're tuning in for the first time on this panel, we will be having breakout sessions at 4 p.m. Eastern. There is a different Zoom link for them, and it will be put in the chat continuously. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.